Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to Mr. Hunter, the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. Mr. Speaker, this resolution by the Democrat leadership sends a message to three parties: America's enemies, America's friends, and America's troops. And I think it's going to be received by friend and foe alike as the first sound of retreat in the world battle against extremists and terrorists. And Mr. Speaker, we're not stopping anything with this resolution. In fact, the Big Red One is already moving its 1st Brigade toward Iraq. The 82nd Airborne, America's All-American Division, is already in Iraq. In fact, they have the 2nd Brigade is already in their sector in Baghdad. As a matter of fact, in the Baghdad plan, which this reinforcements are serving, in all 9 sectors now has Americans and Iraqi forces in place and operating. So you're not stopping anything. You're simply sending a message. And it's the wrong message, because this nation has been, for the last 60 years, involved in spreading freedom, and it's in America's interest to spread freedom. Nobody would say that it's in our interest, or it's not in our interest, for example, to have a free Japan on that side of the Pacific, or to have a free El Salvador in our own hemisphere, or to have those nations which were behind the Iron Curtain, nations like Poland, now standing side by side with us in Iraq. It's in our interest to spread freedom. And Mr. Speaker, I've been here before, a lot of us have. I remember in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was standing up to the Russians in Europe. And the USSR was ringing our allies in France and Germany with SS-20 missiles. And the President of the United States moved to offset those missiles with Pershing IIs and ground-launched cruise missiles. And you had, from the left, a call that this was going to start World War III. And you had pundits throughout this country. In fact, somebody showed me an old newspaper headline the other day, "Better Red Than Dead," which emanated from that debate and that action by President Ronald Reagan. But we stood tough, we offset the Russians, we showed strength, and at some point the Russians picked up the phone and said, "Can we talk?" And when we talked about the disassembly of the Soviet Empire. In our own hemisphere, when we went in and helped that fragile government in El Salvador and stood up a little shield around that government, we had people saying that's going to be the next Vietnam for the United States. Well, it wasn't a Vietnam for the United States, and Salvadorans are standing with Americans now in Iraq. In fact, I think we've got people who have died of old age waiting anxiously for the next Vietnam. Well, now we're in a different part of the world, and it's a tough mission. And moving freedom and spreading freedom in that part of the world is very, very difficult. And I would just say to my colleagues, my friends who have talked about the smooth road not taken, how we've made mistakes. If we just kept that Iraqi army in place of Saddam Hussein, somehow things would be better now. Saddam Hussein's army had 11,000 Sunni generals. Now, what are you going to do with an army with 11,000 Sunni generals whose mission is to stabilize a population which is in the majority Shiite? A lot of people have said we should have had 200, 300,000 troops in country. Now, at the same time, they would say we got to put an Iraqi face on this occupation. How do you put an Iraqi face on the occupation with 200 or 300,000 Americans in country? The facts are there is no smooth road. This is a tough and difficult road. Our military planners have come up with a strategy. It involves 9 sectors in Baghdad with Iraqi troops to the front and with backup American battalions behind them, mentoring them, giving them advice, and in many cases stiffening their spine. Now, there's no guarantee of success, but this is the first time. I think we should check our history, and my friend Mr. Skelton, I think you should check our history and see if this Congress has ever, after a military operation is already in place, is already moving forward, the Big Red One is already moving out, the All-American Division, the 82nd Airborne, already has troops in place, in combat, in the city, that we retroactively say, you know, we don't support this. The only message that can possibly send to the rest of the world is a fractured message. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to end with a comment, with a quotation from Douglas MacArthur in his farewell speech at West Point. I thought it was appropriate for these times. He talks about the American soldier, and he says this: "Their story is known to all of you. It's a story of the American man at arms. My estimate of him was formed on the battlefields many, many years ago and has never changed. I regarded him then, as I regard him now, as one of the world's noblest figures, not only as one of the finest military characters, but also as one of the most stainless. His name and fame are the birthright of every American citizen. In his youth and strength, his love and loyalty, he gave all that mortality can give. He needs no eulogy from me or from any other man. He has written his own history and written it in red on his enemy's breast." And Mr. Speaker, our soldiers are engaged in combat right now. The worst disservice that we can give to them is to retroactively blast and degrade the mission that they are currently undertaking. There is no good role, there is no good purpose that is served by this. So I would ask all my colleagues, let's get behind not only our troops, let's get behind their mission. Let's vote no on this resolution.